Hello there. You're watching All 24 News. I'm your host, Karim Faz-Zachary. This is Russia-Ukraine special coverage. Russia conducted what it called its special military operation in Ukraine on the 24th of February, but its forces withdrew from around the capital Kiev and surrounding regions to Belarus and western Russia in early April. Russia has since refocused its efforts on taking control of the east and south of Ukraine. Russian forces initially made rapid gains in the south, with their main objective being the creation of a land corridor between Crimea and areas held by Russian-backed separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. But strong resistance from Ukrainian forces near Mykolaiv in the west and in Mariupol in the east significantly slowed Russian advances. And to deal with more analysis on the situation in Ukraine and its consequences, I am joined live via Skype by Kyle Inan, senior geopolitical analyst from Washington, USA, as well as Paula Martinez Calero, Spanish political risk and threat intelligence analyst in Amman, Jordan. Thank you, dear guests, for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we start our in-depth analysis, allow me to share with you these updates. Several hundred residents of Raska Lozova arrived in Kharkiv after being evacuated from the village, which was retaken by the Ukrainian army after being under Russian control for 2 months. Although Ukraine has retained control of Kharkiv, the city has been repeatedly battered by Moscow's forces and still faces daily attacks. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukrainian forces are making tactical successes in the region.
The situation is difficult in Kharkiv region, but our army is achieving significant tactical success. In the Donbass, the occupiers are doing everything to destroy all life in this area. The constant and brutal shelling, the constant Russian strike on infrastructure and residential areas show that Russia wants to make this area inhabited.
Let me start with you, Mr. Kyle Inan. Ukraine is claiming that it has stopped Russian troops from advancing and it has retained control of Kharkiv, despite the repeated shelling. How do you analyze the situation on the ground as a whole? And are things taking a different turn for Ukraine, according to you? Is it stepping forward to free itself from what it called invasion?
I think the Russian military invasion is yet to have come to a full cessation. I think the greater idea here being the entire incursion of the Black Sea region and gaining access to the Black Sea region overall. So I don't think in that sense it has stopped taking over Crimea and other regions in Ukraine. It is too early to state that Russia has stopped its military incursion.
Mm-hmm. And how do you analyze the situation on the ground recently? I mean, how long do you think this is going to linger on? And is there anything possible, to do anytime soon in order to perhaps find a diplomatic, resolution to this?
Resolution. Mm-hmm. Sure. At this point, and President Zelensky has announced a few hours back, he definitely stated that the negotiations are at a halt right now, and there's not been many progress gained on the side of Ukrainians, and Russians on the other side are actually claiming that Crimea is still in its entirety must belong to Russia with a security guarantee agreement, and that is actually complicating things. And as the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, has stated a couple of days ago, he said, well, we are actually feeling like we're in a war we're actually not in a war against NATO, but NATO feels like they're in a war against us, the entire NATO. So this has to come to a stop for progress to be made, actually.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that Russia is making civilizational, let's say, claims in order for it to expand. I mean, it denied Ukraine its independence. It denies it to be a sovereign country. It says that it's a Russian anyways. And do you think that these operations of Russia is going to stop at only those civilizational claims? I mean, only the parts that speak Russian, or maybe it could expand further?
No, I mean, if we look at the world from a geopolitical standpoint and say, well, because they're speaking our language, that means that belong to us, we'd be living in a totally different world. So I don't think that justifies Russia's action at all. And Russia is both strategically cornered and still has strategic advantages at some point with economically speaking, with cutting off natural supplies to the rest of the EU, and that is going to create a different geopolitical landscape in the coming few weeks ahead.
Now, I would like to address Mrs. Paula Martinez. Do you agree with what Mr. Kyle Innen has just said? What are your own analysis on the situation and on the ground?
I believe that Russia will not likely stop the aggression anytime soon. I believe that, on the contrary, as the recent discourse of Sergei Lavrov this week has demonstrated, Russia is actually pushing further their discourse. Russia is threatening with a nuclear escalation, which it could be understood from different viewpoints. Like, one of them is that Russia is losing territory, and as it loses territory, it has to escalate in its discourse in order to create some deterrence and thus some negotiations. I don't think Russia is in any point today to actually stop the invasion, withdraw, and stop all the war effort coming back home with very little gains.
Yes. What do you think can stop Russia, Mrs. Martinez? Is there anything else that the world can do in order to stop Russia?
Well, I believe that the initiative that this week was taken by the US and other 40 countries, in the military base of Ramstein in Germany, in which it was stated that military aid was going to be increased towards Ukraine, can be a very big deterrence for Russia and can make Russia understand that their violation of the Ukraine sovereignty will not be unpunished. And even though Western forces will not enter Ukraine territory, indeed, Ukraine will not be alone in fighting.
Very well indeed. Now, moving on to the humanitarian angle, displaced people keep arriving in Zaporizhia every day. More than 114,000 displaced people have passed through the registration centers, but the pace has slowed since the suspension of humanitarian corridors. During a meeting in Moscow, Putin and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres discussed evacuating civilians from Mariupol steel plant to Zaporizhia. Back to you, Kyle Innen. Ukraine claims that Russian shelling continues on its main cities. How are Ukrainian residents surviving, according to your own following of the situation? And what are we expecting from these humanitarian corridors?
To be fairly honest, there are thousands of civilians are in dire need of life-saving equipment and sustenance. Plus, the UN Secretary General's visit, I think, was planned to Moscow was planned prematurely. As you would hear on the Ukrainian counterparts, that they were criticizing the visit because the Secretary General flew directly to Moscow instead of flying directly to Kiev to show support and solidarity to the ongoing conflict. I think that was kind of premature, and sitting in front of President Putin, saying, well, hey, we're imposing sanctions on you, and there's a chance that we are going to remove Russia from the Security Council based on the UN Charter. This is actually creating more of a civilian catastrophe in the regions hit by Russia, because we're going to see in the coming days high hyperinflation, more problems on supply chain side, and we're really hoping that things will de-escalate as time goes by.
So you're saying that the visit of the UN Secretary General was more of a provocative action than it was something that is helpful? Is that what you're saying?
Indeed. So in a normal ideal world, you can't be negotiating and saying, "Hey, I'm going to come to your doorstep," and expect that person to stop their provocative actions. So if sanctions proved so fully and appropriately, then it should be the Russian side coming to Brussels and saying, "Hey, we need to make concessions and stop the ongoing conflict here."
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mrs. Paula Martinez? How do you see the suspension of humanitarian corridors? How is this helping Russia in any way advance in its plan?
I believe that the visit of Secretary Antonio Guterres could actually prove beneficial to the establishment of humanitarian corridors, but I will put this into bracket because previously humanitarian corridors have been open in Mariupol certainly, and Russia has not respected them, and so some of the corridors that have been open towards the east, so let's say towards Russia. Migration of the civilians was only allowed towards Russian, and this of course goes against freedom of movement. This new visit, in which it is being discussed opening a new corridor, could actually benefit Russia because most of the civilians that are still today in Mariupol, they are being held in the Azovstal, iron and steel company, which is being guarded by the Ukrainian forces, and underground are being kept the civilians. So it is a gain for Russia in the sense that evacuating the civilians through a humanitarian corridor and also the Ukrainian forces would allow Russia to take control of this important strategic industry and maybe continue with its war effort.
So do you disagree with our distinguished guest saying that it was a provocative visit, coming to somebody's doorstep telling them that, hey, we're imposing sanctions on you and we want you to comply to international order?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it is provocative. I would say it is the UN trying to make its job in a moment where it has been extremely delegitimated, especially when in the Security Council, which, as a reminder, Russia takes part of it, there was a vote that was being passed to condemn the Russian aggression and call it a Russian aggression. And of course, Russia vetoed it. So that gave a bit the impression that the UN had no say in this discussion and that the UN couldn't have any sort of leverage. By going to Russia, I wouldn't say it is a provocation. I would say it's the UN trying to find its position in this conflict. So let's say the opening of humanitarian corridors, the allowing the International Red Cross entering the ground, allowing international observers entering the ground. I don't think in any sort this is provocative, and actually it could benefit Russia in the way that Putin could also use this as a means to justify that he's abiding to international law, even though in many other ways he's violating it.
How do you see that in Kyle? I mean, she just said that she doesn't see it as something provocative, which is completely the opposite of what you just said. And if the UN cannot stop Russia, who can?
Let's look at what happened following the Secretary General's visit. After Moscow, he went directly to Kiev, which Russian side forces have started bombing Kiev at various parts. That was in the news recently. So again, if this is not provocative, I don't think there's many things that could make it more provocative. Thinking that UN is the main international body for bringing peace and stability to whatever region in the world it is. And if that was the case, I think it would have eased Russia's position in the international arena. So plus the idea of removing Russia from the UN Security Council is going to take things into a different dimension. And we're really going to see perplexity trying to remove or have Russia hold itself out of the UN Security Council, but we'll see if Western allies are coming together to enforce that at some point. But we'll see how, again, like I previously stated, how the gas and oil supplies are going to play into this as Russia's trump card. So it's too premature to speak on that, I think.
What about you, Mrs. Paula Martinez? How do you see the persistence of this lingering war? I mean, the UN apparently is not capable of stopping Russia. Who can stop Russia? And do you think that the world will make a compromise, allowing Russia to take the parts, or I mean, to accomplish its goals in this mission that it started?
I don't know if the world will be willing to compromise, but certainly Ukraine, which is the other part of the conflict, has already stated that would be willing to revisit the status, of some of the Donbas provinces, and it would be also willing to assess its state of neutrality, which both are some of the requirements that Russia clearly stated that will be imperative in order to stop the Russian invasion. So I believe that as the war has created many grievances in Ukraine, on both sides, Russian and Ukrainian, Ukraine has understood that maybe this might be a point of inflection, negotiating on this kind of on this territory.
Thank you indeed. And in a related news, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said in comments published Saturday morning that lifting the sanction imposed on Russia is part of the peace negotiations between his country and Ukraine, which he said are difficult but continue daily. Lavrov said in a statement to Chinese media published on the website of the Russian Foreign Ministry that the Russian and Ukrainian delegations are already discussing a possible draft treaty on a daily basis via video conferences. Back to you, Mr. Kyle Inen. Russian officials are calling to lift the severe sanctions imposed on Russia. However, President Vladimir Putin is still carrying what he calls special military operation against Ukraine. Why is Putin not considering the severity of the sanctions and their repercussion on his own people? Or do you think perhaps he has an alternative to save his country's economy?
That drives in the difference between ideology and what is happening on the ground. So Russia is currently sanctioned for luxury goods, flights, individuals, exports and imports on tariffs, and many other critical goods that are affecting Russia's economy and everyday average Russians. Russia, as you would know, has tied its ruble to the main gold reserve that it has in a central bank to stave off the American dollar influence, so that it is able to juggle and move more swiftly if it has to do an international trade, because the ruble, the national currency of Russia, has started losing value rapidly since the beginning of the war 9 weeks ago. And now Russia is trying to ascertain that it has at least the flexibility to do or sell, internationally speaking, because without the sale of oil and gas, Russia cannot feed its war chest and cannot continue growing in macroeconomic parameters. So it is really important that Russia continues to sell its oil and gas supply.
And Europe just recently announced that technically they are going to stop the sanctions, not the sanctions, I mean that Russia is not going to be able to export its gas and energy products to Europe, mainly during a period of 6 months. And we know the big dependence of Europe on Russian energy products. Do you think this is really possible, Mr. Kyle?
Yeah, let's get into details quickly here. Let me give you a brief example. So the president of the EU Commission has explained that they're going to get 15 billion cubic meters of gas, LNG, from US in regards to the portion of Russian gas that is going to be cut off. And there's this main idea that the EU can withhold or withstand perfectly fine without the supply of Russian gas. I think that's just wishful thinking, because the terminals in the EU are too premature to accept that kind of a massive LNG import at this point. So EU at this point can't survive without Russian gas. We look at Germany, that is importing 40% of Russian gas, followed by Italy. I think there's around 25%. and then Belarus and Turkey, the next importers of Russian gas. So it's very critical. But let me point out here that cutting off Nord Stream 2 is just causing a redistribution of the Blue Stream pipeline that is going through Turkey. So cutting off does not mean redistribution, which EU believes that they're going to overcome so easily. I think that it is easier said than done, but I think it's too early to speak that everything will be fine without inflation. Yes, you're cutting off Russian gas, but how are you making up for it? So EU, on the EU side, again, the president of the EU Commission, Ms. von der Leyen, has clearly stated all the contracts are made in euros, so they can't make every payment in euros, in rubles for gas, oil and gas, as the Russian side has demanded. But again, this is a double-edged, because there are some companies who have already opened accounts in the Gazprom bank, saying we're going to, yes, open a ruble account and the euro account, and the bank will convert, and whatever is converted will be made in natural gas payments. So,
and actually, Russia did prove that. I mean, it did make a move way before Europe started. I mean, by cutting gas on Bulgaria and Poland. And this actually, yes, and this is actually made many other countries alerted about that. I mean, we see how the dependency is deep. How do you analyze this? I mean, what's Russia trying to say here is that you can't survive without me, and I am allowed to do whatever I want?
True. I mean, it's not that tit for tat kind of a deal strategy here. But the thing is, since we're going into the summer months, it'll be more apparent what EU is losing on gas side, on oil side, when we're coming into winter season. It's now too early to speak, but again, Europe is facing high inflation as well as Russia. No country can act alone and say, hey, I don't need other my partners trade for goods, for oil, for gas. You're dependent on Russia to a point where you are able to replace your immediate need for gas. So I think EU at this point does not have the necessary infrastructure to replace Russian oil and gas.
Very nice. Let me address you now, Mrs. Paula Martinez. The West has imposed severe sanctions. How are they affecting Russia on the ground, according to you? And sanctions costs to Russia are partly cushioned by higher prices for gas and oil exports and the avoidance of restrictions through trade conducted with third countries. But the net economic impact on the Russian economy will be negative anyhow. How can it affect Russia, according to you?
So the main impact of the sanctions is Russia has been suffering from a deep cut on access to its foreign reserves in other countries. They have been frozen, and there has been a limit of imposed on like certain type of exports. After that, the Kremlin increased for 20% the interest rates, and foreign Russian businesses were forced by this stage to convert their profits into ruble. So let's say that the implications of the sanctions are being felt by a part of the oligarchy, and are also being felt by the population, which are suffering from pretty high rates of inflation, 17%, which is the highest rate of inflation since 2002. This on one side. On the other side, Putin has sought to decrease the impact of these sanctions by linking the financial sanctions imposed by Europe with the dependence that Europe has on Russian gas. So by imposing the payment on rubles, Europe is actually bypassing some of its own sanctions, and some of the countries are already claiming that they are willing to pay their gas through the Gazprom bank, which they will allow them to pay it in dollars or in euros, and it will be transformed into rubles.
Thank you indeed. And in a video address, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Friday evening that he regretted what he called a brutal and deliberate humiliation of the United Nations, which has gone unanswered. This comes after missiles hit the Ukrainian capital Kiev during the visit of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
It is regrettable, but such a deliberate and brutal humiliation of the United Nations by Russia has gone unanswered. Today, we learned that a journalist, an employee of Radio Svoboda, was killed by a Russian missile that hit an apartment building in Kiev. She is the 23rd journalist whose life has been taken because of the Russian invasion.
Back to you, Mr. Kyle. Can you tell us how do you analyze this provocative attack by Russia during the visit of the UN Secretary General?
Sure. As I previously stated, following the Secretary General's visit to Kiev, Russia tried to provoke the United Nations, and actually, it's perfectly showing that it has no boundaries when it comes to military incursion. So what we need to clearly understand that whether Russia is going to stop in Moldova or other countries by the eastern border of EU. So I don't think the EU is going to take lightly to this, and I think the EU has more tricks up their sleeve to show Russia. But I think Russia is going to counteract very swiftly, as the President Putin has stated. So we will see in the coming days whether we are going into a de-escalation period or going into an escalation period.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Mrs. Paula Martinez? How do you read the shelling of Ukraine's capital during the visit of UN Secretary General? What is the message we can deduce from President Putin to Ukraine and its allies, i.e. Western nations?
I mean, I think it might be some sort of like unrespect for the international order, which the UN is a representative, and which Putin claims to want to change. Let's say Putin wants to change the whole security structure of Europe and the balance of powers. So of course this goes into his narrative and into his intentions. So Kyle mentioned Moldavia, and I think it is very important to mention it because as NATO troops cannot be deployed to Ukraine, Moldavia is indeed part of the NATO treaty, and in case of a spillover of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict into Moldavia, this could indeed provoke a deployment of NATO forces.
Thank you so much. And during her daily press briefing, White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki referred to Russian President Vladimir Putin's invitation to the G20 and reiterated the US President Joe Biden is opposed to Putin's participation in the summit. Mr. Kyle Innen, I get back to you. The G20 is going to be held in Indonesia in 6 months. Don't you think it's a bit early to raise such issue? Why is making early reactions? I mean, what is the aim of this pressure?
I think the idea is to socially and internationally alienate Russia, completely marginalize its presence in the international arena. Perhaps they thought White House is thinking that this is a trump card against Russia, saying, hey, we're going to announce this right now. So Russia feels that they're under pressure, that the international community does not have anything to do with you. Again, and also announced that they will let the international community know whether Russia will participate in the G20 or not. Again, G20, just to remind our viewers here, is a gathering of the biggest 20 economies in the world, and most of which are against the Russian military incursion at this point. But it is still yet to be tested and seen whether it will actually be held in Indonesia. So we will see the exact date and time, or whether the G20 itself will be delayed according to the ongoing situation on the ground.
Very nice indeed. Mrs. Paula Martinez, what are we expecting from this summit, according to you? Do you think Russia will keep its plan of participating? And what could the US, the White House, do? According to the White House spokeswoman, she did not say whether or not the United States would attend the summit. However, they stressed that they are opposed to Russia's participation.
I think it is too soon to know what will happen, but mostly Russia will continue to support its attendance, as of course it doesn't want to be cut off of the international scene. But on the other hand, this is one of the US objectives to cut Russia from the international scene and from international support. I think that a possible cut from Russia from the G20 could indeed provoke more aggressive reactions on Russia, as it has happened this last week with the meeting on rearmament of Ukraine, which has shown international support and solidarity for Ukraine. This has clearly heavily unsettled Russia, so we can expect something similar if this could happen.
Thank you indeed. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in to our coverage. With this, ladies and gentlemen, our coverage, special coverage concludes. Thank you, dear guests, for participation and thorough analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Bye for now.